The morning the deed came through, it was a Tuesday in the spring of 2011, and the sky over the county courthouse was the color of a wet dime, flat and cold and holding rain. It hadn't decided to drop yet. I was 58 that spring, and I had done a good many foolish-looking things in my life, but paying $1,140 in back taxes for 80 acres, nobody wanted felt. Standing there in that fluorescent hallway, with the deed still warm from the clerk's printer, like it might be, the foolish-lookingest of them all. The land was up on the North Ridge, past the old Creamery Road, and it had gone wild in the 14 years since the last owner had died and the heirs had scattered and stopped answering the tax notices. Thistle had taken it. Not a patch of thistle, not a corner of it, but the whole 80 acres of it, Canada thistle and bull thistle and musk thistle, standing shoulder-high in places. A purple-headed army that had marched right over the old fence lines and eaten the pasture down to nothing but its own roots. When I drove up there that afternoon and stood at the sagging gate and looked at it, I will be honest with you, my stomach went a little cold. A man could walk into that field and lose sight of his own truck. There was a chorus of birds working the thistleheads, and not one single thing in that whole 80 acres that a cow could eat or a fence could hold. My wife rode up with me the second time, and she stood at that gate a long while. And she is not a woman given to sentiment or to wasting words. And she asked me the one question that mattered, which was, how many acres are we talking about that we've got to fix? 80. I told her, 80 acres of thistle. And she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, well, then you'd better have a reason. And she got back in the truck. I did have a reason, though I couldn't have laid it all out for her that day in a way that would have satisfied a practical woman. The reason had to do with a man who'd been dead 30 years, and a notebook I hadn't opened yet, and a thing my grandfather told me once, when I was maybe 9 years old, standing in a field very much like that one, though I did not connect the two until later. But I want to be honest about my reasons before I go any further, because a story like this can make a man out to be wiser at the start than he actually was. I did not buy that ground because I had it all figured out. I bought it because it was cheap, and because it butted up against the back 40 of my home place, and because some stubborn thing in me could not stand to watch good land, even ruined land, sit there choking to death when I had, in the barn at home, 31 head of sheep that ate thistle the way other animals eat candy. Now the neighbor came by inside of a week, the way neighbors will. He drives a truck that is always washed, which out here tells you something about a man, and he pulled up to my gate with his window already down and his elbow already out. He'd heard at the co-op what I'd paid, because there is no such thing as a private transaction at a county courthouse, and by noon that Tuesday the diner had a version of the story, and by the weekend the version had grown, and in the grown version I had paid $2,000, which I had not, and I was aiming to build houses up there, which I certainly was not. My neighbor is not a cruel man. I want to be fair to him. He is just a man who likes to be certain, and he had looked at that thistle field the same as I had, and he had done the certain arithmetic. He said, you know that ground's been sprayed twice by the county, and it just come back worse. He said the extension fella had told him you couldn't kill Canada thistle up there without 3 years of chemical and a rotation, and even then it'd take the good grass with it. And he said, what are you going to do with 80 acres of thistle and a fence that's more suggestion than fact? And I told him I was going to graze it. He kind of smiled at that, not mean, just certain. And he said, graze it with what? And I said, sheep. And he said, sheep won't touch Canada thistle. Everybody knows that. The spines'll cut their mouths. And I let that sit because I knew something he didn't, which is that sheep will strip the flower head and the tender top off a thistle before it goes woody if you put enough of them on it at the right time of year and don't give them anywhere else to go. But I didn't argue with him. Out here you learn which fights. The land will let you win, and you learn that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So I just said, we'll see. And he said, well, good luck to you. in the tone a man uses when he means the opposite, and he rolled his window up and drove on. The extension agent came up the next Thursday, and I'll say this plain. He was a good young man, and he meant well, and everything he told me was, by the book, correct. He had a clipboard and a clean tan Carhartt coat that had never seen a real day's work, and he had a soil test kit and a weed identification chart laminated in plastic, and he walked out into the edge of the Thistle about 20 feet, far enough to say he'd been in it, and he stood there writing. He told me the infestation was, in his word, severe, which I could have told him from the gate. He told me the density was somewhere north of 40 stems to the square yard in the worst of it. He told me that Canada thistle spreads by root, that a single plant can send lateral roots 15 feet in a season, that you cannot mow it out because mowing just makes it branch, that grazing it would knock it back for a season, but the root reserves would push it right back the next spring, and that the only thing the research supported was a multi-year herbicide program at a cost, he figured, of about $90 an acre per year for 3 years, which on 80 acres came to a number that made my wife set down her coffee cup when I told her. $21,600, he said, was what it would run to do it right. And then he'd have grass maybe if the residual didn't hurt the seeding. He gave me a pamphlet. He was gone in under an hour, off to the next place, and I stood at the gate holding a pamphlet about a chemical I had no intention of buying, and I thought about how a man with a number can end a conversation, and how often that number is designed to do exactly that, and how rarely the man saying it has stood long enough in the field to see what the field is actually doing. He had walked 20 feet into 80 acres. He had not seen, because he had not stayed to see that, down along the old fence line on the east side, where the ground fell away toward a swale, the thistle was thinner and greener, and the stems were softer, and that there was a reason for that, a reason that was waiting for me under the ground and had been waiting a long time. But I didn't know yet what the ground knew. I want to be honest about that too. I stood there that Thursday afternoon, knowing only that I disagreed with a number, which is a poor and lonely thing to be certain of. And I went home, and I didn't sleep good. It was my wife, practical as she is, who sent me to the notebook, though she didn't know that's what she was doing. She said, "Over supper, if your grandfather ran cattle up on that ridge like you say, then somebody watered them up there, so where's the water? Because you can't run 31 sheep on 80 dry acres in July on faith." And that stopped me with my fork halfway up, because she was exactly right, and because it dislodged something. My grandfather did run cattle on that ridge. That 80 acres and the 40 below it had all been one place, once his place, before it got split and sold off piecemeal in the hard years after he died. And I had grown up hearing that he'd summered stock up on the North Ridge, and I had never once, in all my grown life, asked myself the plain question my wife had just asked me, which was where the water came from. There is no creek up there. The county line ditch is a quarter-mile off and downhill. And I remembered, sitting there, that when we cleared out the old home place after my father passed in 1992, there had been a wooden crate of my grandfather's things that had gone up into the loft of the machine shed and had sat there since, untouched, because grief makes a man a poor archivist, and because there is always something more pressing than the past. So the next morning, I climbed up into that loft with a flashlight, and the crate was right where we left it, soft-cornered and gray with dust, and under a coil of harness leather and a box of square nails, there was a marbled composition notebook, the black and white kind, the cover gone soft as cloth. The pages inside, filled with my grandfather's careful pencil, in a hand that had faded to the color of weak coffee. And I sat down right there, on the loft floor with my back against a rafter, and I read it, and it was mostly what you'd expect, weights and dates, when he turned bulls out, when he weaned, how much a load of calves brought in what year, the plain accounting of a plain life. But it was farm records. It was not the thing I was after. Mall. And I'll confess something to you now that does me no credit, which is that I read for about 20 minutes, and I got to feeling the weight of the man in those pages, and it was more than I had bargained for on a Friday morning. And I closed the notebook, and I put it back in the crate. Because I wasn't ready. I told myself I'd read the rest that evening. I did not read it. That evening. I did not read it for 11 more days, because the sheep and the fence and the ordinary press of a farm swallowed the time, and because a part of me, if I'm honest, did not want to find nothing. It is easier to keep a hope than to test it. But the land was already ahead of me. The land had already started to answer the question, and I just hadn't learned yet to read it. Because here is what happened while that notebook sat in the crate. I put my sheep on the 80 acres. 31 head, ewes, and their spring lambs, and I did not spread them out. That is the thing the extension agent's book was missing, and it is the whole trick of it. If you turn 31 sheep loose on 80 acres of thistle, they will wander and pick and eat the little bit of good grass hiding at the roots and leave the thistle standing, and you will prove the extension agent right. But if you fence them tight, a couple acres at a time, with a single strand of electric netting that I could pick up and move by hand, and you give them nothing else, then hunger and habit take over, and a sheep is a creature of habit and appetite in about equal measure. The first day on a fresh strip they'd nose around indignant, and by the second morning they'd started in on the thistle flower heads, working the soft purple tops before they went to seed, and by the third day they were stripping the tender growth right down the stem, and when I moved them to the next strip you could see behind them a swath of chewed down, trampled, opened up ground, where the sun could finally reach the soil. For the first time in years. It is slow. I want to be clear about how slow it is. I moved that netting every 2 or 3 days, all through May and June and into July, 40-some moves across that field, and it is not exciting work. And there were mornings I stood there in the wet grass at 5:30 with my boots soaked through, wondering what in the world a 58-year-old man thought he was doing out here, proving a point to a neighbor who wasn't even watching. But the sheep were paying attention, even when I wasn't. And along about the middle of July, when I moved the netting down onto that east swale, where the thistle had always been thinner and greener, the sheep did something I noticed, even in my tiredness. They clustered. Endless. 31 head, bunched up on maybe a quarter-acre spot down in the low of the swale, and they wouldn't move off it, and they cropped it down closer than I'd seen them crop anything, right down to the dirt, and they kept coming back to that one spot. Sheep will tell you where the water is if you watch them. They will tell you where the ground is different. And I stood at the top of the swale that evening, watching 31 sheep refuse to leave a quarter-acre of chewed-down mud, and something my wife had said, and something in a notebook I hadn't finished reading, came together in the back of my mind. And I went home that night, and I climbed up into the loft with the flashlight. And this time, I read the whole thing. And I read my grandfather's notebook cover to cover by the light of one bulb hanging off a cord in the machine shed. And it was near midnight before I got to the pages I'd been afraid to find and afraid not to find. The back quarter of the book wasn't accounting at all. It was a different kind of writing, looser, the notes of a man thinking on paper, and it was about the North Ridge, about summering stock up there, and there were rough maps drawn in pencil, the shape of the 80 acres I'd have known anywhere, and along the east side in the low of the swale there was a small circle, and beside the circle he had written, one in that faded careful hand, the word Cistern, and under it the words Rock Cistern. Hand dug, Granddad's time, and I sat up straighter. Because Granddad's time to my grandfather meant the 1,880 seconds, meant his own grandfather, meant a hole in the ground dug by a man I never knew, and my grandfather barely did. And below that, and this is the line that I have not forgotten and will not, he had written, spring feeds it from below, never goes dry. And then, and this is the part that raised the hair on my arms, sitting alone in that shed at midnight, he had written a question to himself, underlined once, never dug. Never dug. He had known there was a rock cistern down in that swale, hand dug in the 1,880 seconds over a spring that never went dry. And somewhere in the hard years, somewhere in the splitting and selling and the dying, it had been let go, filled in, plowed over, forgotten, and grown up in Thistle. And my grandfather had written himself a note to go dig it out and find it again, and he had never done it, never dug. The man ran out of time, the way we all run out of time, with a chore still on the list, and the core had sat there in a crate in a loft for the better part of a century, waiting for somebody to finish it, and the sheep had found it. The sheep, with no notebook and no clipboard and no soil test, had walked that whole 80 acres and clustered on the 1/4 acre where the ground was different, where a spring fed a buried cistern from below and kept the soil damp and the thistles soft and green, even in the dry of July. And they had told me, plain as if they'd spoken it, dig here. I closed the notebook that night, and I did not put it back in the crate. I brought it in the house. My wife was still up, and she looked at my face, and she asked me what it was, and I read her the line, "Spring feeds it from below, never goes dry, never dug," and she, who is not given to sentiment, sat with that a moment, and then she said, "Well," and she said it soft, "Well then, you'd best go find out." And I hardly slept, but this time it was a different kind of not sleeping. I was out on that swale the next morning before 5, with a spade and a probe and a long tape, and I want to tell you how I went about it, because the how is the honest part, and I don't want to make it sound like magic. The sheep had cropped that 1/4 acre bare, so I could read the ground now, and I walked it slow in the gray light, pushing the soil probe down every few feet, and everywhere across the 80 acres that probe went in hard and dry, after 8 or 10 inches, hitting the packed clay pan the extension agent had noted. But down in the low of the swale, the probe slid in, soft and easy, and came up dark and wet, and there was a rough oval of that soft ground, maybe 14 feet across the long way, and I flagged the edge of it with survey ribbon, and I stood in the middle of it, and I probed down, and about 2 feet down the probe hit something that was not clay and was not root. It hit stone. Not one stone, but a line of stone. And I moved the probe and hit it again, and I traced the ring of it out under the mud, a rough circle of set stone, maybe 6 feet across on the inside. And I knew then, standing knee-deep in sheep-chewed muck at 6 in the morning, that I was standing on the cap of my great-great-grandfather's cistern, hand-dug over a spring in the 1,880 seconds, filled with silt, and grown over and lost, and never dug, and now dug. I started in with the spade myself, and made a poor slow job of it, and by afternoon I'd only cleared down about 18 inches over one edge of the ring. But that 18 inches showed me dry-laid limestone, big flat quarried pieces set without mortar, the old careful way, the stones fitted so close you couldn't have slid a knife between them. The kind of work a man did once and expected to last 200 years, and it had. My neighbor came up the road that afternoon, the clean truck, and he stopped at the gate and looked out over the 80 acres, and I watched his face do a small thing, because the thistle was gone. Not sprayed, not poisoned, just eaten and trampled and opened up. A good 60 of the 80 acres already grazed down to bare ground, and green shoots of the grass that had been hiding under it the whole time, coming up now that it could see the sun. And he looked at that a long moment, and then he looked at me down in the swale covered in mud with a spade, and he said, "What in the world are you digging?" And I told him. I said, "A cistern my people dug in the 1,880 seconds, and he didn't say anything to that. He just looked at the grazed down field where the extension man had said nothing but chemical would work, and he said finally, "Quiet, that's not as much thistle as there was," which from him was a great deal. And he drove on, but I noticed his tires got dirty coming up the swale, and I noticed he took a good long look in his mirror before the road bent him out of sight. I did not dig the rest of it out by hand, because a man my age has learned the difference between stubborn and stupid, and I had a fellow I know bring up a small excavator, the little kind you can turn around in a tight spot, and we cleared the silt out careful over 2 days. and I stood over that hole the whole time telling the operator, gentle, gentle. We don't want to crack the stone, because that stone was the work of a dead man's hands, and I would sooner have cracked my own. And when the silt came out, the cistern stood there open to the sky for the first time in maybe 70 years, a hand-dug well of dry-laid limestone, round and true, better than 9 feet deep. And at the bottom of it, clear and cold and rising up through the gravel, was water. The spring my grandfather wrote of never goes dry, say. It was late July of the driest summer we'd had in a decade, and every stock tank in the county was low, and every neighbor was hauling water, and here was cold, clean water rising up out of the ground in the middle of 80 acres everybody had written off as worthless thistle. I had a fellow come out from the county, a waterman, an old boy who'd been drilling and dowsing and testing wells in this country for I guess 40 years, and he climbed down in that cistern on a ladder, and he was down there a good while, and when he came up, he didn't say much at first. Which I have learned is what a real expert does when he sees something that impresses him. He stood at the edge of that hole, and he looked down in it, and he was quiet. And then he said one word. He said exceptional. And then he said, I've tested 1,000 wells in this county, and I've never seen a hand-dug one hold like this. He tested the water, and it came back clean, cleaner than my house. Well, and he measured the recharge and told me that spring was putting out better than 4 gallons a minute steady in a drought, which is more water than I could use if I doubled my flock. And he said, whoever dug this knew exactly where to put it. They dug right down onto the vein. And you don't find that by accident. That's a man who read the ground. That's a man who read the ground. My great-great-grandfather, dead 130 years, reading the ground so well that his work fed my sheep in a drought he never lived to see. And my grandfather, knowing it was there and writing it down and running out of time, and my sheep finding it, and me, the slow, foolish-looking one who paid $1,140 for Thistle. Finally digging it. I have had 2 years now to think on what that ground taught me, and I want to give it to you plain before I let you go, because it's the only thing I've got worth the telling. That 80 acres is good pasture now, all 80 of it, grazed clean of thistle by sheep in one season, the way the book said couldn't be done, seeded back to grass, watered from a cistern, a man dug by hand, in the 1,880 seconds that never once has gone dry in the 2 driest summers since. I never did buy the $21,000 of chemical. The extension agent, and I hold no grudge. He was a good young man. He had a number, and the number was designed to end the conversation. And it was a correct number for the wrong method. And the difference between us was not that I was smart and he was foolish. Because I was not smart, I nearly put that notebook back in the crate for good and never read it. The difference was only that I stood in the field long enough to watch the sheep. And the sheep stood in the field their whole lives. And my grandfather stood in it, and his grandfather dug in it. And every one of them was paying attention to what the ground was doing while the men with clipboards drove on to the next place. My grandfather wrote a thing in the front of that notebook that I've had painted now on a board and hung in the machine shed, and it's this. The ground remembers everything. It's the people who forget. The ground had not forgotten where the water was. The thistle had not covered the spring by accident. The thistle stayed green over that swale because the spring was there. The ground was trying to tell anybody who'd looked for 70 years, and nobody looked. Because looking is slow and certain is fast, and a man with a number and a truck to wash has somewhere else to be. I am not against the modern way, I want to say that. I used that little excavator, and I was glad of it. But I'll trust the old iron and the old ground and the old animal instinct over a laminated chart every day I've got left, because the chart knew 40 stems to the square yard, and it did not know there was cold water 9 feet down that a dead man had dug to on purpose. So here is what I'd ask of you. If you've stayed with me all this way, and I thank you for it, because I know I tell a thing slow, somewhere near you there is a piece of ground, or an old tool, or a notebook in a loft, or an old animal, or an old person, that everybody's written off, that everybody's got a number for. Before you believe the number, go stand out there long enough to watch what it's actually doing. Read the ground. And if you've got your own piece of thistle, your own buried cistern, your own thing that everybody said was worthless right up until you dug, I would truly like to hear about it down in the comments, because those are the stories worth keeping. And if this one meant anything to you, go on and subscribe, and I'll keep telling them, slow as I do, the same as I do everything, which is patient and paying attention. And finally, after a while, getting there.